Hi, this is Landon Bryce from thAutcast.com, and I want to talk with you a little bit about autism and gender. Gender issues are always very complex, and no less so in autism land than anywhere else. To me, the shocking part of the CDC numbers on autism that just came out is that the differential between girls with autism and boys with autism has actually increased. Boys are now about 4.5 times more likely to have an autism spectrum disorder that's identified than girls are. And I think that phrase, "that's identified," is very significant. There is research which indicates that girls are less likely to be diagnosed even when they present more signs of autism. And I think we have to assume that that is responsible for a great deal of the differential. But I think we also need to look at some erroneous ideas about autism that I think cause boys to be more likely to be identified than girls. Many of these can be linked specifically to the British researcher Simon Baron-Cohen, who has really invested in the idea that autism is an excessively male brain, and in fact is looking at the idea that perhaps too much testosterone causes autism, which is nutty, but that's okay. Actually, no, it's not okay, because I think it's his work. He's very popular, he's very influential, and I think his work has really led to an understanding of autism that leaves a lot of women out of the picture, and that simply is not okay. I also think that we identify autism through external behaviors rather than through what it really is, which is a brain that develops in an unusual way. And it looks like that when the brain starts to develop in unusual ways, that tends to happen somewhat differently for boys. Oh, my oven's ready. For boys and for girls. And the kind of communication disorder that's most visible, boys tend to have. The kind of extreme spatial thinking, I think, tends to be more masculine. I think this is going to be controversial. That's okay. I think there's probably a relationship between the fact that I'm gay and the fact that I'm an autistic guy who is as verbal as I am. Some of the research into the brains of gay people and straight people indicates that in some ways the brains of gay men are more similar to the brains of straight women than they are to heterosexual men. Not in always. Men are men and women are women, and that's a more significant difference than who you fall in love with. But there really are gender differences in the brain, and I think it's very likely that that we may be defining autism in ways that affect boys more, and not defining traits that would be more typical of girls, or at least, and also, okay. I think we can also look at the fact that people probably pay attention to different sorts of behaviors in boys and girls, and probably take it more seriously. I hate that. When there's something "quote unquote" wrong with a boy than with a girl, and this is bad news for both genders, because I think we're more tolerant of women, of girls who behave in unusual ways, in some ways, than we are in than boys. I think, well, I think parental authority is. I think girls are actually less tolerant of individual difference in each other in some ways than boys are, and boys can be just intolerant of girls in general. But I worry. There's another thing that these numbers really hit home because a couple of other things happened this week. Number one, the really exciting news in terms of the IAAC, which is the which coordinates basically in some ways and consults on what the United States does in terms of autism action and policy. And there are 3 autistic guys on it, and they're great autistic guys. They're very different from each other, and they're all very smart. And I think they may not have known exactly what they were getting themselves in for with the 3 of them, and I think that's wonderful. And then there's some, there's a bunch of neurotypical people and some just crazy neurotypical people. But when I posted the news about this, very, very reasonably, a lot of people said, well, okay, why are there no autistic women? Well, and that's really, I agree, there should be representation of both autistic men and autistic women. But I don't ever, and maybe it's the company I keep, but I don't think that's entirely true. I don't ever hear complaints when something comes out and all of the representatives are women. A lot of what happens in autism land looks to me like that contraceptive panel where it was about women's health issues and it was all men. Because autism, I think probably affects men and women equally, but we're developing a real problem because I think there's a difference in terms of the communicative capacity, like how easy it is to talk and to speak for the kind of autism that men and women have to have. I think it tend to have. It's a little bit different. But a lot of times there's no representation of autistic men. And a lot of times there's one autistic guy and everyone else is a woman, with a lot of different projects and organizations and etc. And I would encourage you to really to look at those numbers and to, and then to, if you're, involved in an autism project and you look around and there's more women in the room than men, to remember that you're dealing with a condition that, at least as diagnosed, affects almost 5 times as many men as women. And even though I think those numbers are probably wrong, I think if you have more women in the room than men, you don't have quorum. You don't really have basis for a legitimate discussion. Certainly, if you're having a discussion and you have no autistic men and only autistic women, you're dealing with 20% of the population, right? That shouldn't happen anymore. That just should be, people should look at these numbers and they should recognize that if you're doing a project and intend to really represent people with autism, that they're really, unless, and by the way, I'm not talking about something like the Autism Women's Network that deliberately sets out to represent the concerns of autistic women. I don't think we need another one of those, but I think that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are things that claim to be general interest, but where either there are no autistic men who are involved at all, or there is a very token presence for autistic men. And I think certainly we need to increase, I'm not saying less autistic women, for God's sake, that's the last thing I'm saying. More autistic women, go, and more autistic women. But never more autistic women on a project than autistic men. That is the Daryl Issa panel. It's the same thing. And I actually look at people who are involved in projects that, have 100% women involved and they actually write blog posts talking about how horrible it was for somebody. And they're doing the same thing when they're in control. Okay, if there are more women than men at this point in time, with the huge differential, if there are more women than men, I'm not interested, frankly. I'm sorry, at this point in time, that's not true. I'm interested. I care. But I think that there is an issue of gender, an issue of representation, an issue of what autism truly is and what the situation is in the autistic world that you're not taking seriously. And again, I'm not saying fewer autistic women. What I am saying is that we all need to work harder to include autistic men whose communicative capacities, whose relationship capacities, who may be more difficult in terms of relationship to deal with than autistic women. We all, including myself, need to work harder to include more voices like that.